What's up, everyone? They let us get to Friday again, so that means it's time for another episode of this weekly podcast. If you're wondering why that I sound a little bit different, it's because I'm nursing a cold and don't really have a lot of energy, but I'm still here to bring you some cool stuff that I've been reading this week. As always, the articles and stuff that I use will hopefully be listed down below. So this week, I've been kind of reading into Japan. Last week's episode about the cryptids and stuff you've never heard of did fairly well, so I kind of went into that vein a little more, talking about lesser known cryptids, and I thought about what countries do I think would have a lot of lesser known ones, and I come up with Japan, because Japan has no shortage of mythical beasts and mythology and everything, their history dates back thousands of years. So, here we are. So in Japan, they don't really look at them the same way that we do in North America. They don't really call them cryptids or things like that. They call them yokai. And I've actually done a couple videos on things that happen in Japan, so I'll link those at the end of this because, like I said, it's really interesting. And this first one that I'd like to mention is called an Obake. It's a general term for a creature that can shapeshift into human form. Now generally, these beings will appear as an animal, such as a fox or a raccoon dog, a badger, or a cat. I know that the foxes are called kitsune, but in this case, they can shapeshift into human form, generally to get something or play some kind of trick on a human. They also have certain other powers in some other stories, but a lot of them. An Obake is a demon that can shapeshift into a beautiful woman, usually to try and get something from you, to try and get you to agree to something. And I have to wonder, like regular ghosts that you hear about in North America and Europe and Asia and Africa, I have to wonder if whenever they scare you or whenever they screw you over or whatever, the emotional energy that you give off, I have to wonder if they use that as some kind of energy source. Because generally you don't see a ghost sit down and have a steak with the family kind of thing, so they have to get their energy from somewheres. And actually, it's not on Japan, but in the Sunday video coming up, there's a good example of that. The video that's coming up on Sunday is about whales. I really hope you enjoy it because it was super interesting to read about whales as well. And the kind of stealing energy from you or trying to get something from you kind of brings me into the next one, which is called a Gashadokuro. I've talked about this a long time ago on this channel. I'm going to say 3 years now. It's been a long time. But a Gashadokuro is essentially an etheric or skeletal giant that's born out of the bones of many soldiers or victims that get buried into mass graves. Now, as horrible as this is, for a lot of these soldiers, they would die out in the wilderness, and as such, if your body's never found, you are rarely given a proper funeral. And that's one thing I noticed that is a common theme in every culture that I look into for a video. There's always a spirit, a cryptid, or like, in this case, a yokai, that is created because of a lack of a proper funeral. I don't remember what they're called off the top of my head, but there is a spirit in Sweden and the Nordic countries that it's like a child that hasn't had a proper funeral or a proper burial or wasn't christened. All of these are souls that are unable to pass on, and in this case of the Gashadokuro, their souls are reborn as a hungry ghost, and they long eternally for that which they used to have. These people die with anger and pain in their hearts. That energy doesn't go anywhere. It remains long after their flesh is rotted from their bones, and as they decay, their anger ferments and becomes a powerful force, a grudge against the living, and this grudge is what twists them into a supernatural force. When the bones of hundreds or thousands of victims gather together into one mass, they can form the humongous skeletal monster known as the Gashadokuro. It's said that these things were actually more of a commonality way back in the day, like hundreds or thousands of years ago, because nowadays there's not a lot of hunger and famine and war in Japan. But back then, things were much more unforgiving, and it was unfortunately a part of just everyday life. But these beings would wander the countryside in the darkest hours of the night, and if they find a human out on the roads, they would silently creep up and catch their victims. They would crush them with their hands or bite off their head. And it's said that the Gashadokuro remains in existence until the energy that is stored in its body is completely burnt out. Now, the earliest record of one of these goes back well over 1,000 years to a bloody rebellion against the central government by a samurai named Taira no Masakato. Now, for his revolt, he was eventually killed, but his daughter was supposedly a famous sorceress named Takayasha Haim. She used her black magic and summoned the first Gashadokuro to attack the city of Kyoto. So for me, what I get from all this is that I am so glad that I'm born in a time when I can just talk on the internet about it and not have to experience this, and not have to just wake up in the morning and see a giant-ass skeleton just peering in my window. Or imagine being on the opposite side of this revolt, like you're on the government side and you're like, oh, haha, we beat the revolt. And then just in the middle of the night, there's a giant skeleton that just appears on the road. What do you even do at that point? Do you just go, well, that's the way she goes, and then just die? Because I don't know what else you could do. And now carrying on, this one is also very interesting. It's a Japanese bird monster called a Tengu. In some cases, these beings can also take human form, but when they do, they often have massive noses. In the old days, they were feared as terrible creatures that corrupted people, but in modern times, the Tengu is increasingly viewed as a complex character that has a bit of a good side to it, or are morally gray. They're fierce protectors of sacred Japanese forests and mountains, and as such, sometimes they get veneration at Japanese temples or shrines. And the reason why that I brought that one up is because in 2011, there was allegedly a sighting of a winged beast, or a mothman, in Fukushima, Japan. And in true Mothman fashion, he showed up just days before the earthquake and tsunami in Fukushima. The witness's name is Marcus Pools. At this time, he was in Japan on a business trip, and he had stayed with a friend who had long lived in Japan teaching English in the rural town of Okuma. One day, the friends explored around the town, but at night time, they decided to walk along a trail that was kind of on the seaside, and this trail that they happened to be on happened to meander near the nuclear power plant, and at this point, it was still in normal working condition. Now, as they walked along, talking and everything, Pools claims that he heard a sudden whoosh, which at the time he first took to mean the sounds of the ocean. He thought that it was the water crashing against the rocks, but his mind was changed when the sound repeated, and was then followed by an ear-piercing screech. He had never heard anything like this before. It was totally new. His friend heard it as well, as did two other people who were walking on the same path. They were out for a romantic stroll. Pools said that the noise chilled him down to the bone and made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. All the people looked around for the cause of the noise when they heard the sound again. He said the best way he could describe this one was like a city bus's brakes when they are in desperate need of service, loud and ear-splitting. They both continued to look around, and then his friend's attention was drawn toward the plant by another nearby couple. The other couple had their arms outstretched toward it. He looked out towards the power plant, and he could make out a large, shadowy figure that was silhouetted by the plant's lights and the moonlight. It appeared to be sitting, perched atop one of the buildings. As he stared at it, trying to just figure out what the hell it was, the figure suddenly unfurled its wings. He says it was 25 to 30 feet off the ground. The young couple who had first noticed the creature were now screaming and cowering. The man shielding the woman while shielding his head with a jacket. He and his friend looked on in total awe as the creature flew over them, and that's when they noticed that the creature had two large red eyes, They seemed to glow from within, and with a blood-red hue. They were unblinking in the 3 to 4 seconds that they saw them. He also said that the creature made no attempt to disguise itself, but afterward, he had a sick and intense, overwhelming feeling of dread. And then right after it dived at them, the creature suddenly flew off toward the town. They fumbled with their cameras trying to take pictures of it, but it faded away into the distance and just left everyone in a state of confusion and shock. Now, as you can imagine, after this all happened, they immediately left the whole area. They were trying to figure out what they had seen. Maybe it was just a large bird, some kind of optical illusion that was caused by the lights on the plants, although they knew deep down that it was not an illusion. It was not a bird. It was indeed a flying creature. Now, after this, as a lot of people do, he tried to push it out of his mind, to just kind of forget that it ever happened, and to not mention it, not talk about it. Out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. And then after he had returned to the States, he got reminded again of this creature, when people woke him up in the middle of the night that same March, frantically talking about the huge earthquake that had just struck an area where he lived, practically leveling the whole town. Pools turned on the TV, and over the next few days was bombarded with images of the devastation that the earthquake and the tsunami had dealt out. So was this indeed a Mothman in Japan? And better yet, if the Mothman knows when these things are going to happen, how does he know? It makes you wonder if these creatures cause these things to happen, or they just have some kind of foresight to know that something is definitely going to happen, like a dog before a storm or before something terrible happens. The animals always seem to know. It's a very incomparable analogy, but I have to wonder if it's like how people can smell when it's going to rain, or they can feel when there's going to be a thunder shower. I have to wonder if there's some higher sense like that that lets animals, or in this case a Mothman or a Tengu, know that something terrible is about to happen. And are they warning people, or are they absorbing the energy? These are all questions that I wonder about. You probably don't. Maybe you do. Either way, I feel like it's one of those things that I'm just not smart enough to get. I can tell that there's a connection, and I can tell that there's something going on, but I'm not smart enough to know what, who's doing it, or what's the outcome. As I said in last week's podcast, I think that if I saw a Tengu or a Mothman or some version of those creatures, that I would 100% make a video about it, and it would probably be like, I saw the Mothman in New Brunswick, or I saw a Tengu in New Brunswick, and it'd probably be like a clickbait title with the surprised look of me in the corner. And now with the Tengu, where some of them are kind of morally gray, I wonder if that was the case here. It's one of those things where you wonder if it was trying to get at them, or if it was just warning them to stay away. Because you'd think something like that, if it wanted to, get at you, it could. But in this case, it just flew over them, scared the hell out of them, and gave them that all too familiar sense of dread. So, it makes you wonder, was it warning them? Was it feeding off the energy? It's kind of ambiguous, I guess, and I doubt that we'll ever find that out. But maybe somebody knows better than I do. Maybe somebody has figured it out. But now next up here is a creature called a Kappa. I think a lot of people have heard of a Kappa before, but I picked this one to go next because as a kid, I had a book that had Kappas in them, and they scared the hell out of me. Now in some cases, a Kappa will look like a giant salamander or a giant turtle, they'll have a shell and all that. And what they do is they have this little bowl of water in their head, and if you can make them bend over, then I think they either die or have to go back into the water and leave you alone. But basically what they do is that they just draw you into the water and drown you. And I know in a lot of cases this was probably a way to prevent kids from swimming in the river by themselves, the Kappa will get you if you do. But I think at some point in the past, somebody saw something, whether that something be a giant salamander or an actual reptilian humanoid creature that they just saw in the water or saw do something to someone. In fact, in 1801, in Mito, Japan, allegedly a Kappa was captured. It was caught in a net. This Kappa had a turtle-like chest, a crooked back, and apparently, funnily enough, 3 buttholes. And the heights of these creatures, the Kappa, seem to range from as small as 2 feet to as tall as a normal-sized person. They're also said to be very strong, unusually strong for their size. And I don't have it mentioned here in my notes, but if I'm correct, in this book that I used to have, it would say that if a Kappa captured you as a kid, it would eat you and replace you with like a shapeshifter child. And how you would tell that it was a shapeshifter was that there would be no belly button. Now I live near a river that you can go swimming in, and I was terrified to go swimming in that river, even though this is like a totally different continent, totally different water, but just my child head was like, bro, I'm gonna die if I go in that water. There's gonna be a Kappa there, and it's gonna eat me, and it's gonna replace me with a shapeshifter child, and it's gonna be awful. And I would always be thinking of ways to like make the Kappa bow its head or something like that. I don't know. It was just like the one that I wanted to talk about last because it was the one that was most familiar to me because of that just core memory from my childhood. But I hope you did enjoy this video, and if you did, then please like and subscribe and share the video, comment, and all that good stuff. And if you would like to see a certain topic covered for a future episode of the podcast or whatever, feel free to drop that in the comments as well. It's always good to see what people want to hear. And with that, I think I will see you Sunday, and that video again is going to be about whales, and it's pretty interesting and pretty scary, so make sure you tune in. It's really good. And with that, I'll see you then. Thank you for pulling up a stump, and thank you for watching. Make sure to follow the 3 H's of the channel, and I'll see you Sunday.